It's Tuesday, November 12th, exactly 1 week after Election Day. This is a special edition and a look back of the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. Jer, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm doing well. Had plenty of time to collect some numbers, look at the numbers, get a clear idea of what happened. And I thought that's what we do, take a close look at what happened, and then just as importantly, kind of project into the future a little bit. So we circulated the Guardian piece yesterday to our entire list and on social media as well. I would recommend that folks, if they haven't looked at it, it's a short little piece, about 800 words. The title is Donald Trump Didn't Just Win. He expanded his base. So here are just some stunners in terms of numbers. Joe Biden, the Democrat, won with 81.2 million votes in 2020. 81.2. Kamala Harris received 71.8 total votes. That's more than 9 million votes less for the Democrat this time. At the same time, Donald Trump received 74.2 million votes in 2020 and received 75.1 million votes, a gain of about 900,000. Bottom line here was the disappearance of, let's say, almost 10 million Democratic votes. That was reflected in the exit poll. We had every reason to believe in our polls and every poll that we had seen that the levels of enthusiasm among Harris supporters was just as high as the levels of enthusiasm among Trump supporters. In fact, some polls had even suggested that Harris supporters, particularly women, young women, were more enthusiastic than Trump supporters. And yet, almost 10 million fewer Democrats showed up. We had reason to believe, with good reason, that the two political parties, percentage-wise, would be at parity, 36-37% each. In terms of the exit polls that we know thus far, 35% of the total vote were Republicans, 31% were Democrats. We had never seen a 31% figure among Democrats. The rest, I think the major polls, including ours, got a huge gender gap between men and women. We had talked about Trump focusing on the guy thing, particularly young men, showing up on podcasts, on memes, on social media, doing sports kinds of things. We saw Kamala Harris doing the same thing with women and the issue of reproductive rights. But there was a huge gender gap. But Trump won suburban men and women. I'm going to be blunt here, every opportunity he got to, I'm going to say, insult veterans of war, he won among veterans by 21 points, 65-34. He won among Catholics. Democrats always win among Catholics, and yet Donald Trump won Catholics by 26 percentage points. And remember, about a fifth of those American Catholics are Latinos, which is another story about how well he did among Latinos, how he overperformed among Black men, and how there is an education gap that we discovered, a huge one, between college-educated and non-college educated, with the latter about 60% of the total vote voting for Donald Trump. For the Democratic Party, this was a drubbing. It's one of those moments that I know it's become cliche, but it's an existential moment for Democrats. My last sentence, I do not believe Kamala Harris was a bad candidate. In fact, I thought she was a very good candidate, but something has happened to the Democratic Party. I'm going to stop right there. Why don't you pick it up from there?
Yeah, so why don't I just build on that and drill down? I mean, obviously, the most astounding statistic, all of the statistics are worth memorizing, but the one that stands out the most is the 9 million or so less voters for Harris compared to 2020, while Donald Trump basically held and built, but more or less, about held his 2020 performance. And so I have to go to the communications of the Harris campaign, especially in the closing weeks and days. Of course, if you go back to the polling, October was a month that Harris's honeymoon was over. It became evident in virtually all polls, and the race was back to being competitive, and it was less about Harris's honeymoon, and it was more about the issues. But I think where Kamala really made two mistakes was this contradictory, dualistic message of, on the one hand, joy, and how joyful her campaign was, and how joyful the DNC was, and projecting that to the rank and file Democrats at a time of great uncertainty on the geopolitical front, so much that the average voter had concern about what was going on geopolitically. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that voters were reading reports from think tanks. They didn't need to. They knew something was very wrong with too many hotspots in East Asia, in the Middle East, and in Eastern Europe, being potential powder kegs that could spiral out of control. But then also on the domestic front, with more and more middle-class voters, especially young voters, fearing that they'll never have the taste of the American dream. And for those who did, that it was slowly eroding away, that a campaign that came onto the scene with a jolt of optimism, as I pointed out, was in the fashion of an emotional high, seemed doomed to, fall back down to reality. And so that ties into the Republicans, who conversely, I would say, although they did have dark projections, Trump was saying this is what's going to happen to the United States and the world under a Harris presidency. But I think that they were, by and large, more grounded in reality. That is, accepting the reality at hand, that if there were policies, whether it was the border, whether it was on the economic front or the geopolitical front, if they weren't confronted as the major threats that they were, there would be serious implications. And that no doubt resonated more in the end with more voters. And the last thing I'll say that I think also really doomed Harris, and I mentioned this following Pennsylvania, when she did the town hall among the independents, the undecided voters, that to double down in those final hours on that this country was turning into a Nazi regime was just too bold. It's one thing to say xenophobic and racist and hateful and vengeful, but to go to the uber level that we were, on November 6th, going to effectively turn into a bona fide Nazi regime was just beyond exaggeration. And I suspect most voters who heard that just did not buy that we were going to go from a democracy to a Nazi regime overnight. I think ultimately Harris, the campaign, and the media that was on her side shot themselves in the foot. And it played out in the demographics, because we saw, as you mentioned, Donald Trump basically won half a Hispanic vote. He won half of young people who tend to have an affinity for more of a worldly perspective and a global outlook. And he made strong inroads into the black vote, young black men who just weren't buying that.
Those are all good points. I'm going to give credit where credit is due. And in addition to calling out my piece, which Ryan will put up so that folks can see the headline, I want to give credit to James Carville and his wisdom, and Maureen Dowd of the New York Times. For Carville, he said that the turning point in the election where Harris essentially lost it was when she appeared on The View, and she was asked a very simple question: what would you do different from President Biden? And she stumbled, and then she said, nothing that I can think of. It was clear that the president, whether you like him or not, has only a 40% approval rating. Pick your number, anywhere from 2/3 to 8 out of 10 believe the country is headed in the wrong direction. That is a statement about the Biden administration. And while I could see Harris not wanting to insult or distance herself too far from her boss that she still serves, by the same token, she needed at that moment to come up with what makes you different, what makes you fresh, what makes you change the course that we're on. She didn't, she couldn't. And that was I agree with Carville, a major turning point. Dowd's piece is a very thoughtful, longer term piece in which she points out Democrats have a habit of calling people what they don't call themselves. So, for example, wokeism, Latinx. I've met one person in my life who called themselves Latinx, and others in the room shuddered at the thought. Latinos, Latinas, whatever, do not call themselves Latinx. And then there's various adjectives that go before your name and different pronouns. I understand the identities that complicate the lives of people who are different or want to be different. But there is a sense with wokeism that Democrats are here to teach what the next America should call itself and what people should call themselves. It's in the most benign way, too much for too many people. And in the least benign way, it's about as offensive as you can possibly get. But 9 million plus fewer voters is stunning. Please respond to that, and then let's take a few minutes at the end to begin the process, which I'm sure will continue on. What happens to the Democratic and the Republican parties? But why don't you pick up from my comments first, if you want.
No, I think it's well said. I think just a closing remark in that, that sentiment of what is called wokeism and addressing the newer stances of gender identity and more sensitivity towards those things is not something that, should just be thrown to the dustbin, because a lot of people hold that sentiment, but at the same time, it's not a national campaign, and it has proven itself as a very poor thing to put maybe front and center in a political campaign, because at the end of the day, right, most people are going to be concerned about or want to know how their standard of living is. And look, I'm not saying that doesn't play a role in a standard of living for people who face that reality, but we have to remember that there are more unifying issues.
Absolutely. So my closing remarks will just be very brief. For the Democrats, the problem is that they have to stop being the nation's hall monitors The little girl who raises her hand and says, "Teacher, you forgot to give us a homework assignment."
Hmm.
The Republicans have a bigger problem. They have to govern now. And the new administration is going to have to make good on promises. The new uh, immigration czar, border czar, is saying we will deport 12 million people. Well, come on. Can you, for starters, imagine the traffic, imagine the feeding, imagine the logistics, imagine how many people need to be hired at a time when the administration wants to reduce the number of federal employees. Absolutely impossible. And a number of other things that are being promised that the Trump administration is going to have a very difficult time delivering on. But they have the White House, they have the Supreme Court, they have both houses of Congress, and there will be high expectations for them to deliver. I choose to think that that's a real problem. And so that'll breathe life into an opposition party, but the Democrats have to figure out what an opposition party is all about, what it really means.
Okay, let's pick up on some of those points next time around.
Sounds good to me. Okay, thanks. Have a good day. And don't forget, up on the screen, my book about how to read polls. Bye-bye now.